Hi, this is Esther with Discover Your Origins. In this video, we're going to take a good look at the 1930 U.S. Census and also take a look at the John Henry Eaton family and see what's happened to them since 1920. The biggest thing about the 1930 U.S. Census is that it was taken right at the start of the Depression. The act for the census was passed in 1929, and the census day was April 1st, 1930. And so it was taken right at the start of the Depression, and it captured an economic state. The government really wanted the data for the economic questions as soon as possible. And so the Census Bureau rushed the data. There was a little bit of concern that the numbers that they reported weren't accurate. And that's because the census was taken right at the start of the Depression, and perhaps not everyone had quite been impacted yet. So there was follow-up surveys done with the economic questions in 1931 and 1937, and that information was used as a basis for some of the economic programs that came during the Depression. You can see here I have a picture of a farmer in 1932 and just the discouragement that he probably was feeling during the Depression of how hard things were. It's hard for us in our day to quite understand the despair and whatnot of the people and how hard it must have been for them. And so the 1930 U.S. Census is significant for that reason, is that it captured a point in time in history in which a large number of people were impacted by this Great Depression, this change in the economy. But overall, the questions that were asked were very similar to 1920. And so let's go to the Family Search Research Wiki and look and see what it has to say. You can see here in the middle of the page the types of questions, and they're very similar to the 1920 census. There was a little bit of variation in the order of the columns and exactly what was asked, but they're for the most part the same. There were a couple of questions that are interesting. Probably the most unique question on the census is, did you have a radio set? Which was the first time that the census asked a question about technology in the home. So that's an interesting question. The marriage question asked the age at first marriage. So you can use that to calculate a marriage date. And you have to remember this is the age at first marriage. And so the couple that you may be looking at in the census may be in their second or third marriage. So you have to pay attention and not assume that this calculated marriage date applies to the couple that you're actually looking at. So just look at it carefully. But overall, the rest of the questions, are not unexpected. If we scroll down on this page, it gives a little bit more information about things that are unique about this. So like I said, the ownership of a radio was a unique question. Also, there was a question about if a person had attended college. The questions about whether to omit or include people who had been deceased or born, depending on what day that was, whether they should be included or not. It's outlined here. There was no separate Indian schedule in the census, and so people who lived on a reservation was included in the general population schedule with a couple of variations. They included the degree of Indian blood and the tribe. Servicemen were included in their duty posts, and there was also a special schedule for seamen on merchant vessels. All of the states and the territories were covered. As far as I know, everything was covered. As far as missing records, it's hard to say for sure. According to Family Search Research Wiki, there are no states that were missing. That doesn't mean that there aren't actual missing records. And the government microfilmed the census in 1949 and then destroyed the original enumeration sheets. So there's no way for us to go back now and know whether there was a sheet that was missed in that original microfilming. Also, of course, today, things that are digitized are done, of course, through digital cameras and or have a much higher resolution and stuff. And so we are just stuck in some ways with this 1949 microfilming, which may not be very high quality, and not knowing for sure if they got everything. We just cross our fingers and hope that we can find who we're looking for. And in most cases, I think everyone's probably there that was counted, but you just never know for sure. Let's go and look at Wikipedia. Wikipedia also goes over the census questions, but also reports on the statistics. And so let's look. The total population increased about 14% to 122 million. The most populous state was New York, and the least populous state was Nevada. All of the states increased in population except for Montana, which dropped 11,000, about 11,000 people. The most populous state was New York City again at almost 7 million people, followed by Chicago and Philadelphia, Detroit, and Los Angeles, who are all over 1 million people. So those are even some of our biggest cities today. All right, let's go look at John Henry Eaton. So to recap, John Henry Eaton was living in Lawrence County, Tennessee in 1920 with his family and mother-in-law. They were living in an owned home free of a mortgage. And whether John Henry actually owned that home or someone else, not entirely clear, but he wasn't paying rent. And if he did own that home, then there should be property records for that somewhere. So a point of possible further research. But in any event, let's look at his family here. So his wife is Hattie Lou, and then his children. He has the four boys: William Henry, Robert Louis, Charlie Edward, John Hubbard, and then his daughter Gracie Cleo, and Carrie Leota had passed away in 1917. So let's go look at the family in the 1930s census. So the first thing to note right off the bat is the family has moved to Florence, Alabama. And if you're familiar with this area of the country, Florence, Alabama is just south of Lawrence County. And the people who lived in this area often went back and forth between Lawrence County, Tennessee, and Lauderdale County, Alabama. And the border was pretty porous, so the people were moving either for economic reasons or for families. And and they could easily go from one location to the other between censuses and multiple times in search of work. And I suspect that's probably was true for John Henry, although he was in Lawrence County for quite a while. So we'll start on the far left side of the census, and you can see here there's the street name, Trade Street, and then there's a house number. So in previous censuses, the enumerator would number the houses themselves. So they would say house 1, house 2, house 3. In this case, these are the actual house numbers, street numbers for the house. I was able to verify that by looking at a death record, which gave the street address for someone in the family who had died, and it was 309 Trade Street. So that is the actual house. And you can then go look and see if the house is still standing, which I did, and the house is still there. Probably looks different than it did in 1930, but it's cool to know that you can actually go and see where these families lived. The next thing to notice is that John Henry's oldest son, William, is living next door to him in 301 Trade Street with his wife. William Henry is 28 years old. His wife is 26, and he'd been married for 5 years because his age at first marriage was 23. He's living in a rented home and probably in an apartment of this Elvin Lovelace, who's right above him. He's also at 301 Trade Street. So the two families are there. And so he's probably renting a room or part of the house there. John Henry, who's living at 309 Trade Street, is also in a rented house. And his rent is $7 a month. So maybe he has a little bit bigger house or something. He's paying a little bit more money than his son, William. Well, John Henry and Hattie, they're 48 and 45 years old. We have their age at first marriage, which was 17 and 15. So remember, they were married very, very young in 1899. And then they're with their son, Charlie, and Hubbard, or this is spelled Hubbard here. And it's actually John Herbert. And then their daughter, Grace, or Gracie. So we have the birthplace for all of these individuals, and John Henry says he was born in Alabama, his father was born in Alabama, and his mother is United States, and believe that his mother is born in Alabama or Tennessee. And then Hottie's parents, Hottie's born in Tennessee, and then her parents are Mississippi, and she says Georgia, which I have to go back and look because I'm not sure that that's right. But they only reported what they themselves knew. So let's slide this to the left and take a look and see what they're doing. So John Henry here is listed as a carpenter, and he's working on dwelling houses. And I think dwelling houses, they could be regular residential homes, but there was also a lot of infrastructure building starting to come in the Muscle Shoals area where they were building dams along the river for power generation. So it's possible he was working on temporary housing for that. Not really sure, but working as a carpenter. And then his son is working as a laborer at the fertilizer factory. And the question is, were you employed? And John Henry says yes. His son doesn't have an answer here, but probably he was working. And then neither of them were veterans. Interesting, change in occupation here. John Henry had worked at a sawmill, then he worked as farming, and now he's working as a carpenter. So you can kind of get a sense of the economic condition of the family. You would think that Charlie, their son here, who's 21, would have gone out on his own and started doing his own thing. William, he's kind of gone out on his own, but he's not gone very far. So you kind of get this sense that the family is just kind of staying close, supporting each other, gathering their resources, and just trying to survive. And I think that's probably true for a lot of people on this page. So now the big question, or the most interesting question that's on this census, is radio set. Did the family own a radio? And if you look in this column, John Henry does not have a radio, and neither does William Henry Eaton. And if you look on this whole page, even for people who owned their homes, like this person here, Joe Rippey, he owned his home and he doesn't have a radio either. And so you can kind of scroll through here and see that that column is blank. And if you look at the pages before and after, nobody owned a radio. And so I looked to see what the average cost of a radio was in 1930, and it was $10 for the low end. That was more affordable than it had been, but it was still more than their monthly rent. And so still a little bit of a luxury. You can imagine that if they were just barely able to afford their rent and some food, that they would not have any money left over for something like a radio. And perhaps in time they could have saved for something like that, but at least in 1930, they didn't have one. So interesting, if you can find your family in 1930 and just look and see if they had a radio. That's kind of an interesting curiosity. And I hope that you'll look at the 1930 census for your family and just see what you can learn about them. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.